For a look at disparities in cancer care, please welcome Chen, a reporter at ProPublica, Brian Rivers, the director of Morehouse School of Medicine Cancer Health Equity Institute, and Nancy Goodman, the founder and executive director of Kids vs. Cancer. To lead the conversation, welcome back the Atlantic's Olga Khazan.
Okay, thanks, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about who is actually getting access to these breakthrough treatments, these clinical trials, and who isn't getting access, and how that affects the treatment and the patient. So first we're going to start with Caroline, who has done a lot of work on clinical trials, who's in them, who's not in them. First, can you kind of set the scene with why is it important to have a diverse population in a clinical trial?
There's so many good reasons to have diverse population in clinical trials. So I did a story earlier this year that looked at who was in cancer clinical trials. And one of the things that we found, which I'll show you with a couple slides in a second, is that a lot of minorities are very much underrepresented. And that creates a problem, I think of it, both for the current patient and the future patient. The current patient is unable to get access to those cutting-edge treatments. It's not an option for those patients to be in the trials, even though we know they're suffering from the cancers. The future patient, though, suffers because there's no data being gathered. There's no information about how that treatment affects them and whether it looks like the rest of the population. Do you want me to?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, so tell us what you found in your story.
So what we did, my colleague Riley Wong and I put together two data sets. One comes from the FDA, which started in 2015 to publish the breakdowns of who was in trials for newly approved drugs. So they have individual pages for each of those drugs. We manually put those all in a spreadsheet, and then we went to the National Cancer Institute and looked up their incidence data, so who is affected by this cancer, and we compared them. So one example that we have, so this is multiple myeloma. Black patients are more than twice as likely as white patients to suffer from it. So there are fewer Black Americans in the US overall, so they're about 20% of all cases in the US. These are the 4 recent trials of drugs that were newly approved, and on average, fewer than 5% of the trial participants were Black. So we looked at 31 trials, and the left column here shows who is most at risk for the cancer being treated. White, Black, or similar risk. The right-hand side is who was most represented in the trials. So you can kind of see there's a huge gap here. And we had this repeated again and again and again in pretty much every cancer that we looked at.
Wow. And tell me some of the things that doctors said to you when you were like, hey, why aren't more African Americans being steered toward clinical trials? I mean, you mentioned that some of them didn't even bring it up with their patients, right?
Yeah, so there are so many different reasons sort of contributing to this disparity. One of the big ones was just basic awareness. I talked to so many patients who said, I didn't know what a clinical trial was. My doctor never said the words clinical trial to me. I talked to one doctor who said, oh, there's this presumption that minorities don't want to be in trials, so he knows someone who just never brings it up with his patients because they just presume they're not going to participate. So I think that's the most basic level of problem. But then there are financial burdens. If you are lower income, you might not be able to take a day off work because the trial's not going to compensate you for lost days' wages. It's not going to compensate for childcare. It's not going to compensate for elder care. That's a set of issues. There's another issue with particularly the Black American community where because of past incidents like the Tuskegee trial or Henrietta Lacks, there's a fear and there's a lack of trust in the medical community. So I talked to a lot of patients who said, you say trial, I hear I'm going to be a guinea pig. Why would I ever sign up for that? So I think there are so many barriers at play here. And then there's also the factor that the FDA doesn't require there to be a certain representation of minorities in trials. So I think there's both issues on the ground that are cultural, and then just structurally, this isn't something that we as a society has said, you know what, we're going to make this a requirement at a regulatory level.
Wow. And that's pretty wild that they said we didn't think that African Americans were interested in being in trials. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so Nancy, you're actually noticing this with age groups also. So actually, children often don't have access to clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about why that happens?
Sure. So in the case of children, there are pediatric clinical trials. They tend to be around drugs that are decades older than adult clinical trial drugs. And for kids, companies are allowed to expressly discriminate against kids by having 18 as the minimum age of eligibility. When my son Jacob was diagnosed with a rare pediatric brain cancer, medulloblastoma, there were no clinical trials of novel drugs available to him. And I contacted 8 different companies and asked for access to the drugs on what's called compassionate use, which means off the trial. And understandably, all 8 drugs said no. So my child didn't have an opportunity just to try any of these drugs.
Wow. And what are some of the, I mean, you mentioned some of the reasons for that. Is that the companies just don't find it worth it to include children, or?
You know, I don't really know. I think designing trials is so complicated that it's just sort of one variable. It's always been 18 as the minimum age of eligibility. I think, honestly, the main reason is companies just don't rethink that issue. And to lower the minimum age of eligibility means to rethink, you know, what are the pharmacokinetics of this drug? How would this drug be possibly different in adolescents than it is in adults? I will say, though, that the FDA issued what's called a guidance, which is a document of recommended conduct for companies, encouraging companies now to lower the minimum age to the beginning of adolescence. So we're really thankful to the FDA for that, and we pressed hard, and the FDA did a great job.
Is there a chance they could lower it even further?
The guidance provides that in cases where it makes sense to go lower, companies should go lower. I to be honest, don't. I would wish that that would happen. I don't anticipate that, but even going down to adolescence would be a terrific advance.
Wow. So Brian, I wanted to pivot to you because you actually mentioned that not just for the clinical trial reason, but African Americans actually have a 25% higher mortality rate from cancers, from all cancers, right?
Sure.
And so what are you working on that is aiming to kind of make a dent in that problem?
Sure. And allow me to provide some context for the approach, because I think we clearly understand the problem and the magnitude of the problem, but you know, in terms of the strategies that we put in forth, I think it has a lot to do with the context that we're in. So I'm at Morehouse School of Medicine that is nestled in the heart of Atlanta. It is a freestanding independent medical school that was established to advance primary care among underserved groups throughout the state of Georgia. There was a lull or a low in terms of the number of physicians actually caring for underserved populations. Morehouse School of Medicine is known for its social mission, which is focused on improving the health and well-being of individuals and communities, increasing diversity in the health profession as well as the scientific workforce, but then also addressing primary care through programs such as through research, service, as well as education. So it's with that backdrop, you know, I offer the different collaborations that we have going forth. The one in particular is with the American Association for Cancer Research. Earlier this year, we collaboratively launched an initiative entitled 2020 by 2020. Now, the point of this initiative is to consent 2,020 African-American cancer patients out of the city of Atlanta, provide genomic sequencing of their tumor as well as their tissue, aggregate this with clinical data to better understand why do we see this disproportionate impact among this particular group. And we hope to achieve this by 2020. Other partners that are helping provide seed funding for this initiative include Moffitt Cancer Center in Tugen, Orion, or the Oncology Research Information Exchange Network, as well as the Pelotonia Foundation through the Ohio State University. This initiative was kicked off during Mike Calgeri's presidency of AACR. So that's one strategy where we find, through collaborations, we can offer viable strategies to address some of these issues. Another collaboration we have is with Color, where Color has partnered with Morehouse School of Medicine to offer the Color test to underprivileged groups for them to better understand their genomic risk for different types of cancer as well. And then lastly, because we know that we're continuously facing inequities in patient-centered care, in partnership with Winship Cancer Institute at Emory University, we have our physicians working under this initiative funded by Merck entitled the Alliance to Advance Patient-Centered Care. And so we have a number of initiatives that are targeted to reach these groups, and I think it's uniquely designed to be delivered through Morehouse School of Medicine because of the trust that we have. Again, going back to our social mission. We're known for our social mission as it relates to engaging underserved populations, in particular African Americans.
What can be done to, I guess, get the word out about clinical trials, maybe dispel some of the myths that are out there and actually get patients engaged? question for anyone really is how do you get beyond the like very savvy, very wealthy population, to kind of expand the number of people who know about clinical trials?
Well, I think historically, our conversations have been limited to academic cancer centers.
Yeah.
And we know that the majority of high-risk groups are treated in community-based settings. And so we have a study that's ongoing, funded through the National Cancer Institute within our Patchy partnership, Partnerships to Advance Cancer Health Equity, that's looking at the barriers and facilitators to clinical trial participation among minorities. And so we're sitting down, we're having conversations with the CEO of our Safety Net Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. We're sitting down with referring physicians and research PIs, as well as patients themselves, just trying to understand, what are the impediments and then what are the facilitators to increase participation. Mm-hmm. And with that, we're hoping to develop a culturally based application to be used by a clinical trial navigator to effectively interface with the patient population, realizing that there's a level of education that needs to be administered prior to the acts. Now, we're finding from previous studies that individuals, especially high-risk groups, surprisingly, underserved populations, will engage in clinical trial participation, but it's more so of who is doing the acting and what are they being asked to do.
Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an issue that can only really turn if everybody cares about it, but I think if everybody has it front of mind, I think even very small things can start to make a difference. For example, if every community oncologist educated their patient on what a clinical trial was and answered those questions at a very basic level. Or if every pharma company had this, at the front of their mind when they picked trial sites. I had this interesting conversation with a drug maker where I said, why do you only have about 1.8% of your trial participants as Black patients? And they said, well, it's because of where our trial sites were located. And I said, well, didn't you pick the trial sites? Like, you have some engagement here. And I did find that drug companies that I asked, hey, what's your plan here with diversity in trials that had very well thought out answers, that had working groups within the company, such as Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah.
They're by no means perfect, but their numbers actually looked a lot better than other drug companies. So I really do think that if all the stakeholders care about this, there are very little things that we can start doing that can make a difference.
And you guys mentioned, especially that there's like a legacy. There's a reason why people are a little bit reluctant when you say something like experimental treatment. It doesn't sound great when you have cancer and you've historically been mistreated by doctors. I guess, could you guys talk a little bit about like the legacy of things like Tuskegee and other kind of elements of racism in medicine and how that's influenced what we're seeing today?
And so, being nestled in Atlanta, Georgia, and in a cancer partnership with Tuskegee University, which houses the National Bioethics Center, which is one of the outgrowths or responses as a result to what actually happened with the Tuskegee study. The bioethics framework is paramount to our approach. And so at Morehouse School of Medicine annually, we do a Henrietta Lacks seminar series, and where we invite the community out, and we talk about research ethics, and we present different cases in terms of how research should be done correctly. Also, as it relates to Tuskegee, we also have community-based education programs, whether we're working with churches through their health ministries, whether working with barbershops or beauty salons. Again, decentralizing this information, getting it out in plain language. It's very simplistic form.
Yeah.
I don't want to oversimplify the approach, but oftentimes that's what's necessitated. Just increasing awareness, increasing education, more information around clinical trials. And again, a lot of the research is showing there's not an unwillingness for African Americans and other minority groups who want to participate in research and clinical trials. It's just who is doing the axing.
Yeah.
For pediatric trials and for kids with cancer, the percentage of kids who are enrolled in trials is, depending on the survey, somewhere between 60 and 90%. So here's a population that really wants to and can enroll in clinical trials. And for kids who want access to drugs that are only in adult trials, really the rate limiting factor is companies' comfort with lowering the minimum age of eligibility when it makes scientific and medical sense.
Yeah.
One other thing I'd add is I think everybody in this room is super savvy. You all are smart people who are fully steeped in healthcare, and just wanted to remind you that, when I was talking to a lot of patients for this story, health literacy is a huge challenge. And I talked to patients who did not know the names of the drugs that they were on, who were in trials and did not know why they were in trials,
Yeah.
like who literally do not have the most basic of understanding. And that's why I think trust is so important, because I did talk to one patient who credits clinical trials to saving his life and bridging him to successive bone marrow transplants. And he's now a patient advocate and very savvy. But I said, well, for your first trial, what made you join the trial? And he said, I trusted my doctor. She said, join a trial. I said, okay.
Yeah.
You know.
It's as simple as that sometimes. Well, any questions from the audience? We should have mic runners coming around. See one question up there. Yep.
Hi, I'm Mary Elizabeth Williams. I'm a journalist and also a phase 1 clinical trial veteran. There are barriers on both sides, right? On the patients and on the medical professions. And one of the things I'm curious about is the incentive for these pharmaceutical organizations, because they want to get patients who are going to survive, because they want to push their drugs through. They want success. And they are looking at a patient population, and if they feel you're not going to do well, you're not going to perform, they don't want to admit you. How do we change that? How do we incentivize these clinical trials for the drug companies?
So this is an issue, companies get to pick their patient population, their eligibility criteria, and it's understandable after spending, 10 years developing a drug that you want that patient population that's going to respond the best. And the FDA has actually come out with 5 guidances in the cancer space, urging companies to include children on trials, people with comorbidities, people with brain metastases, HIV, or secondary cancers. And I hope these guidances will encourage companies to rethink some of these issues. That's step 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've identified a really big issue here that actually works against minorities in particular, because, as you said, drug companies want the healthiest sick patient in their trials, and it just so happens for many different reasons that minorities tend to have more comorbidities, tend to have diabetes or be obese, and tend to have more factors that will remove them from trials in the first place. So that's definitely a big issue. As to what you said with the FDA guidances, I only hope that the FDA can make this a priority, because I do think that the companies need that push, because without that push, or a bigger response from patients and consumers that they ask for data on drugs that looks like them, I think without that, you're right, there aren't a huge number of incentives right now.
Hello, thank you. One of the issues that I've come across with cancer patients is that by the time they think about enrolling in a trial, they've already had previous treatment, and that in itself can disqualify them from many trials. And perhaps a way to inform patients early on in the treatment that they receive that trials are an option, but there's certain obstacles to qualifying for trials. It's hard to say to a patient, I imagine, look, if this doesn't work, don't try anything else yet before going into a trial. But my question is, have you come across the medical community that is dealing with, or the reporting community that's dealing with addressing the issue of what actually disqualifies you as a second round of treatment for enrolling in a trial?
It's a really great question, and one of the really hardest things when, Jacob was, my son was in treatment, is sometimes you have to wait between one treatment and enrolling in another treatment, and it's just like this terrifying period, and maybe companies could shorten that period. Maybe the data's not quite as clean, but maybe people will be more willing to enroll on trial if they don't have to wait so long.
Yeah.
So, and there are a lot of other reasons people fall out of eligibility. It's really hard. You want it to roll on a trial when you've run out of treatments.
And last month, the American Association for Cancer Research convened a think tank, and we focused on 3 topic areas. One included clinical trials, and that actually came up as a topic that needs further investigation. Research design, inclusion, exclusion criteria, as well as a number of other parameters. And so we're looking at the data, and we will put forth recommendations in terms of the direction we should go as relates to that particular issue.
Yeah. There.
Hi,
sorry.
Casey Smadzinski. I had a question on just the on trials in general and making sure that the patient knows the difference between maybe a good trial and a bad trial. And looking at trials in advanced cancer, it looks like some trials are very focused on just getting a significant p-value or using a surrogate endpoint like progression-free survival that might not translate into overall survival, even though that the time frame for the median survival is 6 months, so you could use an overall survival as a primary endpoint, but that might not be the best for the company to push their drug forward. So how do we either de-incentivize pharmaceutical companies from running these types of trials that are just looking at trying to get them pushed forward or into the next phase, or arming the patient with more knowledge so they can choose a trial that might have better science behind it and they don't enlist on a trial that is just being tested for significance?
Ooh, you have touched on a very tricky topic here. I think you're right that I had previously done a story that looked at the fact that trials are increasingly moving towards these shorter endpoints, like progression-free survival, and obviously there's good incentive for companies to get their drug on the market sooner than later. I'm not sure that's going to go away anytime soon, and I really don't have a good answer for that. If any of you do, let me know. I'd be really interested. But I do think that this does go back to patients being educated and understanding what endpoints are, and I think there are some great patient foundations that do this work, and they have patient trial navigators that are, like, for example, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society hires nurses that will get on the phone with the patient and talk them through their trial options. I think services like that are really invaluable for patients because otherwise, I think a lot of them either never hear about clinical trials or they hear about one, which is, the one that their doctor happens to be involved in, and their doctor says, will you enroll in my trial? And I think, that's also a problem of not even having the options in the first place that you can choose from. So I think that might be
And not to put the burden totally on the patient, but I'm a firm believer in patient education and patient empowerment. And, I think we, through collaborations, through partnerships, we should be able to, achieve that community-based education to the degree that individuals are informed when they engage with their provider if this trial is right for me based on my clinical profile. And so we have to do a better job building collaborations. Right now, we work in so many different silos based on the cancer type that we're addressing, but there's so many parallels, that we sort of can glean from and under the banner of lessons learned and replicate those strategies toward advancing patient education around clinical trials.
Yeah. Well, that's unfortunately our time. I know this is a big topic. Thank you so much, Caroline, Brian, and Nancy, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.